The moment Louise Rhodes walked into the town of Dusk Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she did so with her chin raised and her carpet bag swinging at her side like she owned every inch of the dry, cracked earth beneath her boots. She had not come to Dusk Creek to make friends. She had come because her sister Martha had written her a desperate letter from the town 3 months prior, describing a life that had gone sideways in ways Martha had never anticipated, and Louise had packed her single bag, kissed the doorframe of her rented room in San Antonio, and boarded the first westbound stage she could afford. That stage had deposited her, unceremoniously, in the middle of what appeared to be the most sun-bleached, wind-swept, temperamental stretch of land she had ever laid eyes on. Dusk Creek was not much to look at. A main street with a general store, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a livery stable, a sheriff's office that leaned slightly to the left as though exhausted by its own purpose, and a scattering of homes that spread out behind the main drag like an afterthought. The hills beyond the town were golden and barren in equal measure, and the sky above them was so impossibly wide and blue that Louise had to stop walking for just a moment to take it in, despite herself. She found Martha at the edge of town, living in a small house with her husband Denton Graves, who turned out to be the source of the desperation in the letter. Denton was not a cruel man so much as he was a useless one, and the combination of a poor harvest season, a gambling debt to a man named Silas Pratt who ran the saloon, and a general unwillingness to do anything about either situation had left Martha thin and worried, and in need of someone to tell her what to do next. Louise told her. She told her plainly, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee and her hands folded in front of her, that Denton needed to stop drinking at the Copper Bell, that the debt to Silas Pratt needed to be managed directly rather than avoided, and that Martha needed to stop pretending everything was fine when it was clearly not. Martha cried a little. Denton looked at his boots, but they both listened because Louise had a way of speaking that did not leave room for argument. It was not unkind, but it was certain. It was the voice of a woman who had grown up the eldest of 5 children in a household with no father and a mother who worked from dawn until well past dark, and who had learned early that the truth, spoken directly, was always kinder in the long run than a comfortable lie allowed to fester. She had been in Dusk Creek for 4 days when she first saw Clayton Brooks. He came into the general store while she was purchasing flour and a length of calico fabric for Martha, and she noticed him first because of the silence that seemed to arrive with him. Not the silence of a man who inspired fear, though he was tall and broad-shouldered in a way that filled the doorframe, but the silence of a man who had learned to move through the world without making unnecessary noise. He wore a worn brown hat, a canvas work shirt the color of a late summer sky, and boots that had seen more than one hard season. His dark hair was a little too long, curling slightly at the collar, and there was a quality to his jaw that suggested he had not smiled recently and perhaps had forgotten he was capable of it. The storekeeper, a talkative man named Mr. Abernathy, lit up when Clayton walked in. "Clayton Brooks," he said warmly. "Haven't seen you in 2 weeks." "Been riding hard." "Some," Clayton said. His voice was low and even, like a river moving through flat country. He set a list on the counter without further commentary. Mr. Abernathy began reading it and Louise finished calculating her purchase, but she was aware, in the way that perceptive people are always aware of the people around them, that Clayton had glanced at her twice in the space of a minute. Not rudely. Not in the way some men looked at women, with an assessment that was more claim than curiosity. It was more like the way a man looks at something unexpected in a landscape he thought he knew well. She did not acknowledge it. She paid for her items, tucked the flour under one arm and the fabric under the other, and walked back out into the sunshine. She heard Mr. Abernathy say, behind her, "That's Louise Rhodes, Martha Graves's sister, just arrived." She did not hear Clayton's response if he made one. The following week, she settled into something like a routine in Dusk Creek. She helped Martha with the house and the small kitchen garden. She accompanied Denton to the Copper Bell on a Thursday afternoon and had a frank conversation with Silas Pratt about the debt that left the saloon owner looking slightly stunned and Denton looking as though he could not decide whether to be grateful or mortified. She negotiated a repayment arrangement that was fair to both parties, something that apparently had not occurred to anyone involved until she suggested it. People in Dust Creek began to take notice of Louise Rhodes, some with admiration, some with wariness, and a few with outright irritation, because she had a habit of saying things that needed to be said, and not everyone appreciated that. Reverend Hollies, a stout, self-important man who gave Louise a wide berth after she gently but firmly pointed out during a Sunday gathering that his sermon about the virtue of silence in women was not, as far as she could tell, supported by the scripture passage he had cited, referred to her privately as a difficult woman. She was informed of this by Mrs. Abernathy, who told her with a conspiratorial smile that half the town agreed with Louise and the other half were just too accustomed to agreeing with Reverend Hollies to admit it. It was at the church gathering, actually, that she crossed paths properly with Clayton Brooks for the first time. He arrived late, which struck her as the behavior of a man who had been talked into attending against his better judgment. He sat at the back of the small whitewashed church on a bench near the door, and she noticed, watching from her seat beside Martha, that he did not sing when the hymns were sung. He did not bow his head during the prayers. He simply sat there, quietly present, as though fulfilling an obligation without subscribing to it. After the service, outside in the flat yellow sunshine, Mrs. Garfield, who was the self-appointed social director of Dust Creek, introduced them. "Miss Rhodes, have you met Clayton Brooks? He has the ranch out past the eastern ridge, the Double B." "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Louise said, and she looked at him directly because she always looked at people directly. Clayton took his hat off. He was, she noted with a complete absence of sentimentality, a very handsome man. There was a weariness to him, something around the eyes that spoke of long days and longer nights, but underneath it was a face that was strong and honest, and she had always responded to honesty in faces the same way she responded to it in words. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "Mr. Brooks, you've been in town about a week," he said. It was not a question. 11 days, she corrected because she was precise. Something shifted slightly at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the memory of one. 11 days, he agreed, and you've already negotiated Denton Graves out of his debt with Silas Pratt. Someone needed to. No argument there. He looked at her steadily. "You're staying, then, in Dust Creek." She had not actually decided this. She had been so focused on sorting out Martha's situation that she had not given much thought to what came next. But something in the way he asked the question, as though the answer mattered to him in a way he was not sure he wanted it to matter, made her answer more carefully than she might have otherwise. "For the time being," she said. He nodded once, as though that was a satisfactory answer, and put his hat back on. He said something brief and polite to Mrs. Garfield and then walked away toward the hitching post where a bay horse was waiting for him. She watched him go, not because she was charmed, she told herself, but because she was observant. The next time she saw Clayton Brooks, it was an accident. She had gone for a walk in the early morning, before Martha was up, because she needed the quiet and the open air after a week of close quarters. She went east from town, along a dry creek bed that the locals called the Gray River despite the fact that there was no water in it most of the year, and she walked until the town was a collection of small shapes behind her, and the hills were close enough that she could see the individual scrub oaks scattered across their faces. She heard the horse first, and then saw him, coming down along the ridge trail at an easy walk. He spotted her at about the same moment and pulled the bay to a halt. For a moment neither of them said anything. The morning was cool and enormous around them, the sky just beginning to shift from lavender to gold. "Miss Rhodes," he said. "Mr. Brooks." He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention that she had already begun to associate with him, a kind of careful, unhurried assessment, as though he was not going to form an opinion until he was sure of it. "You walk far from town," he said. "I needed the quiet." He glanced back toward Dusk Creek and something moved across his face that she could not quite read. "I know the feeling," he said. He paused. "You're welcome to go as far as the ridge. The trail's good. Nothing to worry about out here, this time of year." She noticed that he offered this as information rather than permission, which she appreciated, because she had not asked for his blessing to use public land. "Thank you," she said, with genuine warmth rather than obligatory politeness. "I might do that." He touched the brim of his hat and rode on, and she watched him until the trail took him behind a fold of hill, and then she stood there for a moment in the vast quiet morning, feeling something she had not felt in a considerable while, something unnamed and not entirely welcome, threading itself into her chest like the first tendril of a climbing vine finding purchase in a wall. She walked to the ridge. She came back to Martha's house with the morning light full on her face and her hair wind-blown and a look that Martha, who knew her sister better than anyone, immediately noticed. "What happened?" Martha asked. "Nothing," Louise said, and hung up her hat. "I went for a walk." Martha looked at her for a moment with the quiet, perceptive gaze of a woman who had grown up in the same house with Louise and therefore was not deceived by her in the slightest. Then she smiled and said nothing, which was, in its own way, its own kind of answer. It was Denton who, in his roundabout and not particularly graceful way, was responsible for bringing them together properly. He had begun, under Louise's firm encouragement, to look for work beyond the failing kitchen garden, and had inquired about work at the Double B Ranch, Clayton's place. Clayton, it turned out, needed hands for the spring cattle work, and Denton, who knew enough about ranching to be useful if not expert, was hired on for a trial period. Martha was so relieved she nearly wept. Denton looked less tormented than he had in months. And Louise, who had orchestrated this outcome through a combination of gentle pressure and the judicious application of common sense, found herself invited to Sunday supper at the Double B at the end of Denton's first week, as Martha and Denton were also invited. She dressed carefully that evening, not because she was trying to impress anyone, she told herself, but because she respected the occasion. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that her mother had once said matched the color of her eyes, and she braided her dark hair back and pinned it neatly and looked at herself in the small mirror in Martha's bedroom with a critical eye until Martha came up behind her and said, simply, "You look beautiful, Louise." The Double B was a working ranch, and it showed. The house was not fancy, but it was solid and well built, with a deep porch that faced west and caught the last of the evening light, and there was a neatness to the yard and the outbuildings that spoke of a man who took care of what was his. There were two other ranch hands, a taciturn older man named Hector and a cheerful young man named Will who could not have been more than 20, and they ate supper together at a long table in the kitchen with easy, if not voluble, company. Clayton cooked, which surprised her. He was competent at it, not inspired, but the venison stew was good and the cornbread was honest, and he moved around the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who had fed himself alone for a long time. That observation settled in her chest and stayed there. Over supper, the conversation moved through the topics that all conversations in the territory moved through in the spring of 1878. The cattle markets, the railroad that was inching its way through the region, and what it would mean for ranchers, the ongoing tensions between local ranchers and the homesteaders who were beginning to claim land along the creek beds, and the broader, harder subject of the Comanche resettlement, which had left the land around Dusk Creek with a particular kind of emptiness that everyone felt and few spoke about directly. Louise, who had read widely and thought carefully, and was not in the habit of keeping her thoughts inside her head when the opportunity to express them was present, said what she thought about all of it. About the railroad, which she believed would eventually benefit the town, but currently served primarily the interests of men who did not live there. about the homesteader conflict, which she believed was being handled badly on both sides, about the resettlement, about which she said quietly but clearly that the word resettlement was a polite term for something considerably less polite, and that the land around Dusk Creek carried a weight because of it that should be acknowledged rather than ignored. There was a brief, charged silence at the table. Hector looked at her with something that might have been approval. Will looked slightly stunned. Denton looked at his stew. Martha looked quietly proud. Clayton looked at her with those steady, careful eyes, and she braced herself, because she was accustomed to men at this point responding to her directness with irritation or dismissal, or the particular kind of condescension that felt like being patted on the head. Instead, he said, "I think that's right." She looked at him. "It should be acknowledged," he said. "I've thought the same thing." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted between them, something quiet and significant, like the moment a door that has been shut for a long time is opened just an inch, and the air that comes through is both fresh and startling. After supper, when Martha and Denton were helping clear the table with Will and Hector, Louise stepped out onto the porch because she wanted the evening air and the wide sky, and after a minute Clayton came out and stood beside her. They did not speak for a moment. The sun had gone down and the sky was that particular dark blue that comes right before true night, and the first stars were arriving. "You said what you thought at supper," he said finally. "All of it." "I generally do," she said. "Some people around here don't appreciate that, in a woman." She turned to look at him. "I know, but I've never found it useful to say less than I mean. And I would rather people know exactly where I stand than waste time with them pretending I stand somewhere else." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a candor that surprised her, "I find I'd rather hear it than not. I've been out here alone long enough that the silence has started to feel like it has weight." She looked at him more carefully. There was something behind the words, something genuine and a little raw, as though he had not meant to say quite that much. "How long have you been alone out here?" she asked, and it was a direct question, but she asked it gently. "Going on 4 years," he said. "Wife passed, fever, winter of '74. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it with the fullness she always brought to that phrase, not as a formula but as a genuine acknowledgement of someone else's loss. "Thank you," he said. He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man who is deciding how much to give away. It changes a place when the person who used to fill it is gone. Every room, the porch especially. She used to sit out here in the evening. Louise did not say anything, because sometimes what someone needs is not a response but the space to finish. "I think I stopped noticing things after a while," he said. "The way the light changes. The sound of the creek in the spring. You stop noticing because noticing requires someone to share it with, or at least that's how it felt." "And then?" she asked softly. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and there was something in his expression that was both careful and open at the same time, like a man testing the footing on ground he thought he remembered but wasn't sure of. "And then," he said, "something new arrives in the landscape, and you start noticing again." She held his gaze for a moment, and she felt the heat of what he meant without either of them putting a name to it. And then she looked back out at the stars because she needed to look somewhere that was not directly at him. "I have to warn you," she said, and her voice was steady but lower than usual, "that I speak my mind and you would not like it. Not always." He made a sound then, almost a laugh, and it was the warmest sound she had heard from him yet. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "I've been surrounded by silence too long to be frightened of someone who says what she means." She turned to look at him then fully, and she saw the quiet light in his eyes and the small, certain smile at the corner of his mouth, and she felt something settle in her chest like a stone finding its resting place at the bottom of a clear stream. Easy. Right. Without ceremony. "Louise," she said. "If we are going to be honest with each other, my name is Louise." "Clayton," he said. The stars were fully out now, spread across the enormous Texas sky like someone had scattered a handful of bright sand, and they stood together on the porch of the Double B Ranch in the spring evening of 1878, and let the quiet settle around them like something belonging rather than something lonely. The courtship that followed was not a simple one, because neither of them was a simple person. Louise continued to help Martha, but she also found herself at the Double B more frequently than was strictly necessary, and she and Clayton fell into the kind of company that is both the easiest and the rarest to find, the kind where honesty is not frightening but welcome, and where silence, when it comes, is companionable rather than empty. They disagreed regularly. About ranching methods, about town politics, about the best way to manage the ongoing issue of Silas Pratt, who had not taken kindly to having his debt arrangement renegotiated and who had begun making pointed comments about the Graves family, and by extension, about Louise herself. Clayton's instinct was to handle Silas quietly and without confrontation. Louise's instinct was to handle him directly and without delay. "If you let a man like that simmer," she told Clayton one afternoon, sitting on the fence rail of the Double B corral while he worked with a young horse, "he does not cool down. He boils over when you least expect it." "And if you push him," Clayton said, not looking up from the horse, "he feels cornered and he does something stupid. He will do something stupid eventually regardless. Better it happens on our terms than his." Clayton stopped and looked at her. The young horse shifted behind him. "Our terms," he said. She realized what she had said and met his gaze without flinching because she was not a woman who flinched from the implications of her own words. "I meant the town's terms." "Of course you did," he said, and there it was again, that almost smile, and this time it came with something warmer in his eyes that made her look away toward the hills. He was right about the horse, and she was right about Silas Pratt as it happened. Silas, finding that his pointed comments were not having the effect of driving Louise or her opinions out of Dust Creek, escalated. He began telling people that Denton's hiring at the Double B was charity rather than merit, and that Clayton Brooks was a lonely man being taken advantage of by a sharp-tongued woman from San Antonio who was only in Dust Creek because she had nowhere else to go. Louise heard this second-hand from Mrs. Abernathy, who told it with both the discomfort of someone relaying something unpleasant and the slight relish of someone who suspected the telling would produce interesting results. It produced results the very next morning. Louise walked into the Copper Bell at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, when Silas was setting up his bar, and the saloon was empty except for one old man asleep in the corner and a cat occupying the best chair. She sat down at a table near the bar, folded her hands, and when Silas turned and saw her, she watched him go through the calculation of whether to throw her out before deciding the result was not worth the effort. "Miss Rhodes," he said flatly. "Mr. Pratt," she said pleasantly, "I think we need to have a conversation. I think you need to mind your own business." "Mr. Pratt," she said, still pleasant, "you have been publicly casting aspersions on my character and on the character of my brother-in-law and on the professional judgment of Clayton Brooks. I am asking you, directly and without rancor, to stop it. Not because I am particularly wounded by your opinions of me, but because it is uncharitable and untrue, and it is making the people of this town uncomfortable, which is, I suspect, the actual objective." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He was a broad, florid man with the particular confidence of someone who had held a position of informal power in a small place for long enough to mistake that power for something permanent. "And if I don't," he said, "then I will write a very detailed letter to the Dust Creek Courier about the gaming practices at the Copper Bell that have been a source of quiet complaint from nearly a dozen residents for the past 3 years, and I will ask Mr. Abernathy and the Reverend Hollies and Sheriff Dunbar, all of whom I have spoken with this week, to co-sign it." The silence in the saloon was long enough that the cat stretched and yawned and the old man in the corner made a sound in his sleep. Silas Pratt said nothing for a moment, and then he picked up a glass and began polishing it with a cloth and said, in a tone that was not exactly gracious but was significantly deflated, "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding." "I believe so too," she said, and stood up. "I'm glad we cleared it up." She nodded at him with genuine courtesy, because she had not come to humiliate him but to resolve the problem, and when the problem was resolved she bore no grudge. "Good morning, Mr. Pratt." She walked back out into the sunlight and Clayton was there on the sidewalk, which surprised her. "Were you waiting?" she asked. "I was passing," he said, and from the set of his jaw and the slight tension in his shoulders it was entirely clear that he had been waiting. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "What did you say to him? What needed to be said?" He looked at her for a moment and then he did something that surprised her entirely. He laughed. Not the restrained, almost sound she had heard from him before, but a real, full, open laugh, and the sound of it broke something open in the street between them, something warm and alive. "Lord, Louise," he said when the laugh subsided, "you really do say what you mean." "I told you I would," she said, but she was smiling too helplessly because his laughter was one of the better sounds she had heard in recent memory, and it was reshaping her face in spite of her best intentions. He looked at her for a moment, smiling in that way that was new and not yet accustomed to his face, and then he said more quietly, "Can I walk with you a while?" "Yes," she said, "you can." They walked to the edge of town and along the dry creek bed, and they talked for an hour about things that mattered and things that did not and a great number of things in between, and it was the best kind of conversation, the kind that feels, while you are having it, like the most important thing happening in the world. He told her about the Double B, about how he had built it with his first wife, Elaine, starting with nothing but a piece of land and a loan from a bank in Dallas that he had taken 3 years to repay. About how the ranch had grown because of their combined labor and because of luck, which he acknowledged was a factor that people in the West preferred to call hard work, but that was, at least in part, genuinely luck. About how it felt, after Elaine died, to keep building something that had been meant for two and was now for one. She told him about San Antonio, about her childhood, the 5 siblings and the absent father and the mother who had kept them all fed and clothed and together through sheer determination. About her own years of working, first in a dry goods store and then as a seamstress, and then as a bookkeeper for a cotton merchant who had, to his credit, hired her despite the raised eyebrows of his associates. About why she had never married, which was not, she told him clearly, because she had never been asked, but because she had never been asked by someone who seemed prepared to be answered honestly, and she had always felt that being answered honestly was the minimum requirement. He was quiet for a moment after she said that. "That's a fair requirement," he said. "I think so," she agreed. "And I'm asking," he said. "I mean, when I speak to you, I'm asking honestly." She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something remarkable to the hills around them, turning them a deep amber gold that matched the dry grass and made the whole landscape look like something a painter had arranged carefully for maximum effect. "I know you are," she said. "That's why I keep talking." He stopped walking. She stopped walking. They were at the base of the ridge she had climbed on that first early morning, the same ground where she had first heard his horse on the trail above, and the connection between that moment and this one was not lost on her. He said her name, just her name, quietly, Louise. And the way he said it was the way a man says the name of something he does not want to lose. She felt the whole of the moment pressing against her, the wide sky and the golden hills, and the scent of dry grass and something flowering that she couldn't name. And she looked at him steadily because she always met moments directly, and she said, "Clayton." He reached out and took her hand, and it was a careful gesture, a question rather than an assumption. And she let him take it and felt the warmth of his fingers and the rough texture of a working man's palm against hers. And neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. They stood at the base of the ridge in the late afternoon of a Texas spring and held each other's hands and let the silence around them be the good kind. What followed were weeks that felt, to Louise, like the opening of a season she had not expected. She was not a romantic in the conventional sense. She had spent too much of her life being practical, making decisions based on what was necessary and true, to be given to the kind of dreaming that found everything beautiful and all difficulties minor. But the truth was that she looked forward to mornings with a particular quality of anticipation, because mornings sometimes brought a reason to ride out to the Double B, and the Double B meant Clayton. He came into town on most Saturdays and made a point of stopping at whatever she was doing, which might be at the market or at Martha's house, or, occasionally, at the small school where she had begun helping the teacher, a young harried woman named Miss Crane, with the older students who needed reading instruction. He would appear in the doorway and she would look up, and there would be that moment, that brief exchange of looks that was not yet what it would become, but was already more than mere acquaintance, and they would find their way to each other through the business of the day and eventually to a walk or a shared supper or the porch of the Double B in the evening. He began to open more as the weeks passed. The solitude of 4 years had left him not closed exactly, but compressed, like a man who had gotten accustomed to fitting himself into a smaller space. He was slowly, carefully expanding back into the original shape of himself. She could see it happening, and it moved her in a way she found difficult to analyze and chose not to analyze too carefully, because she was a practical woman and analysis had its limits. One evening in late May she arrived at the Double B to find him at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him and an expression on his face that was somewhere between concentration and worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, because she could read him now, at least in some moods. "The Eastern grazing land," he said. "There's a dispute with a homesteader family that's moved in along the creek bed. The Prentices. They've fenced off about 40 acres that were grazing rights my father-in-law gave me when I first bought the land, but the deed language is apparently not as clear as I thought." She sat down across from him and looked at the ledger and then at the deed document beside it. She was a bookkeeper. She was accustomed to documents. "May I?" she asked, and he pushed the deed across the table to her. She read it carefully. He watched her read it with the particular expression of a man who has learned that this woman does not read things for show. "The grazing rights are implied here," she said, pointing to a clause, "but they're not explicitly stated as separate from the water rights. And the water rights are what the Prentice family is likely basing their claim on. That's what the lawyer in Abilene told me," he said, "before he told me the case could go either way. The Prentice family," she said. "Have you spoken with them?" He looked at her. "You're going to tell me to talk to them directly." "I'm going to tell you to talk to them directly," she confirmed. He almost smiled. "And if they're not reasonable, then you'll know that. And you'll have the information you need to decide on next steps. But in my experience, most people who seem unreasonable have not yet been spoken to honestly about the actual problem." He was quiet for a moment. "You could come with me," he said, "when I talk to them." "I was about to suggest it," she said. They went the following afternoon. The Prentice family were a young couple, barely into their 20s, with a small baby and an earnest, anxious air that spoke of people who had come west full of hope and were now discovering the considerable gap between hope and reality. Thomas Prentice was defensive at first, standing in front of his fenced line with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. But Louise had spoken to enough people in the grip of anxiety and precarity to recognize that defensiveness for what it was, and she was gentle in a way that did not sacrifice directness. She explained the situation clearly and fairly, acknowledging both Clayton's legitimate historical claim and the Prentice family's genuine need for the water access they had assumed was included in their land purchase. She proposed a shared arrangement, a schedule for water access that would serve both the ranch cattle and the Prentice homestead, and a clarification of the grazing boundary that gave Clayton the acreage he needed while leaving the Prentice family their creek access. Thomas Prentice looked at his wife, a young woman named Clara who held her baby on her hip and looked back at her husband with eyes that said, clearly, "This is better than the alternative." He said he would need a day to think it over. Louise said that was entirely reasonable. Riding back to the Double B in the late afternoon, With the sun going down behind them and the land spread out ahead in its enormous golden way, Clayton rode beside her in silence for a while, and then he said, "You know, I think I would have gone out there and made it worse." "You might have," she agreed, because she was honest even when it was slightly uncomfortable. "I would have," he said. "I was angry about it. And when I'm angry, I get quiet, and when I get quiet, people think I'm angrier than I am, and then they get angry back." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You've noticed that about me." "I notice things," she said. He was quiet again for a moment, and then he said, "What else have you noticed?" It was the kind of question that had a small risk in it, and she recognized the risk and took it anyway because that was who she was. "That you're a good man," she said. "That you're kinder than you look, which is saying something because you don't look unkind. That you loved Elaine, and that her loss still lives in you in the way that real losses do. And that this is not a wound you've been trying to hide, but something you carry with honesty, which I respect. That you have been lonely in a way that was beginning to hollow you out, and that you are less lonely now, and that it is making you more like yourself." The last of the sun was just touching the western edge of the sky, and the hills were dark, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass and something distant that might have been rain. And Clayton pulled his horse to a stop, and she pulled hers alongside, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something raw and full and completely undefended. "Louise," he said. "Yes," she said, and she knew what he was asking, and she was answering the question behind the question, the one neither of them had said out loud yet. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly. Not because I think ceremony is required between us, because I think you've never needed a great deal of ceremony, and honestly neither have I, but because it deserves to be asked well." She waited, the way she waited for things that mattered without rushing them. "Would you stay?" He said, "In Dust Creek, not for Martha, though that's part of it too, but because I would very much like it if the landscape I am looking at every morning included you." The evening air was still and vast around them, and the first star was arriving in the east, and she felt the question settle into her like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "I'll need to say what I think," she said, "about most things, even when you don't want to hear it." "I know," he said, "and I am not a quiet person by nature." "I know that too," he said, and there was a warmth in it that was nearly laughter. "Then yes," she said, "I'll stay." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand again, the way he had at the base of the ridge, careful and certain at the same time. She held his hand, and they sat there on horseback in the turning evening of a Texas spring, and the feeling between them was not the dizzy, breathless thing of young romance, but something older and surer, something made of honesty and time and the particular alchemy of two people who have both known enough of loss and silence to know, without any doubt, that this is what they were looking for. The Prentice situation resolved itself. Thomas Prentice came to the Double B 2 days later and shook Clayton's hand and agreed to the terms Louise had proposed, and Clara Prentice sent over a jar of preserves with a note that said, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for seeing us as people." Louise put the note on the mantel in Martha's kitchen and felt privately that it was one of the better things she had accomplished in Dust Creek. Martha, when Louise told her she was planning to stay, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry and wrapped both arms around her sister and held on for a long time. "I knew," Martha said, "from the moment you came back from that walk and had that look on your face." "I did not have a look on my face," Louise said. "You absolutely had a look on your face," Martha said firmly. Denton, in his own way, was equally pleased, and to his credit he expressed it with a directness that was not his usual style. "You're good for him," he told Louise, over a supper that was notably more cheerful than any supper she had attended in his house when she first arrived. "And if I'm being honest, which I suppose I should try to be, you're good for this family too. You showed up and sorted everything out." "I just said what I thought," Louise said. "That's more than most people do," Denton said, and for once she could not argue with him. The summer of 1878 was hot and bright and full. Louise found work as a bookkeeper for Mr. Abernathy, who needed help with his accounts and who, Once he saw her work, declared himself entirely satisfied and immediately stopped worrying about 3 years' worth of slightly confused ledgers. The work suited her and paid her enough to feel independent, which was important to her. She did not want to come to Clayton from a position of need, because need was not what she felt for him. What she felt was something chosen, deliberate, freely given, and she wanted him to know the difference. Clayton was courting her with a seriousness and a gentleness that she found entirely right. He brought her things she needed rather than things that were merely decorative: a good knife, a supply of the coffee she liked that was hard to get in Dust Creek, a volume of essays she mentioned admiring and that he rode 12 miles to the next town to find. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He let her disagree with him, which he did with a kind of patient grace that she found increasingly admirable, especially when the disagreements were significant, and she was not, by her own admission, always gentle in the expression of her views. There was a night in mid-July, after a church social where Louise had had what could charitably be described as a vigorous exchange of views with Reverend Hollies on the subject of whether women ought to have a voice in the management of the church's charitable fund, that she arrived back at the Double B, with Clayton feeling the particular tiredness of someone who has said exactly what they needed to say and is now ready to be somewhere comfortable. They sat on the porch in the dark, and she was quiet for a while, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. "Worn out?" he asked. "A little," she said. "I don't regret saying it, but sometimes saying things costs more than people think it does." "I know," he said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair, just resting his over hers. "Does it help, at least, when you say what you think?" She considered the question. "It helps the situation, usually. Whether it helps me personally is harder to answer. Sometimes it just makes me tired." "Then let me say something," he said. "You don't always have to carry that. The saying, 'When you're tired, you can be quiet with me,' I will not misread the quiet." She looked at him in the darkness of the porch, the lamplight from inside the house making a warm shape behind him, and she felt something in her chest that was beyond what she had words for, which was unusual. And she sat with it for a moment and then leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and he stayed very still, the way a man does when he is holding something he does not want to disturb. "Thank you," she said, quietly, just for him. "Always," he said. It was the 1st of September, 1878, when Clayton Brooks asked Louise Rhodes to marry him. He did it at the base of the ridge where they had first stood together in the late afternoon, because he remembered that moment and knew she did too. He had brought her out there on the pretext of looking at the site for a new fence line, which she had seen through immediately but accompanied him on without comment, which was its own kind of answer. He did not make a long speech. He was not a man given to long speeches. He turned to her in the golden September light with the hills behind him and the wide sky above, and he said, "I want you to be my wife. Not because I need someone to run the house or because it's the proper thing or because the town expects it. Because I love you, Louise. Because the last 4 months have been the first months in 4 years where I have felt like myself, and that is because of you. Because you say what you think and you mean what you say, and you are honest in a way I have never found in anyone else. Because I want to be married to someone I can talk to and argue with and sit quietly beside in the evening, and that person is you." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long, considered moment, because she was not a woman who made decisions in a rush, and then she said, with a certainty that was as complete as anything she had ever felt in her life, "Yes." He put a ring on her finger. It was a simple gold band that had been his mother's, which he had kept for reasons he had not fully understood until recently, and when it was on her hand she looked at it with the same directness she brought to everything. And then she looked at him and smiled, fully, without reservation, and he looked so startled by the full force of her smile that she laughed, and he laughed too. And then he pulled her close and held her in the September afternoon with his arms around her and his chin against her hair and the hills surrounding them in all their ancient, golden silence. She told him later on the porch that evening that she was not nervous. He said he believed her. She said she was, however, aware that she was not an easy person to be married to, and he said that this had been clear from the beginning and he was counting on it. "You're counting on it," she repeated. "A quiet life I already have experience with," he said, "and it is overrated." She looked at him for a moment and then reached up and pressed her palm against his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand, and the tenderness of it, on both sides, was the kind of tenderness that does not need to make a show of itself. They were married at the end of October. The wedding was in the small whitewashed church where they had first spoken properly, and Reverend Hollis officiated with a manner that was at least partly genuine, because, whatever his views on outspoken women, even he could see that there was something true in the room that morning. Martha stood beside Louise in a yellow dress that had been remade from the calico Louise had bought on her very first day in Dust Creek, and Denton stood beside Clayton, looking more proud and upright than Louise had ever seen him. Mr. and Mrs. Abernathy were there, and Will the ranch hand who could not stop grinning, and old Hector who sat in the back and did not grin but whose presence was its own form of blessing. The Prentice family came, Thomas and Clara with the baby, and Clara had brought wildflowers from the creek bed and given them to Louise without a word, and Louise had carried them instead of the formal bouquet Mrs. Garfield had suggested. The town of Dust Creek turned out, because Dust Creek was not a large town and weddings were events that mattered. Even Silas Pratt came, though he sat near the back and left before the dancing. There was dancing afterward in the street in front of the church because Mrs. Abernathy had organized it, and Mrs. Abernathy was not someone who did things by half. There was a fiddle player from the next town over, and someone produced a harmonica, and someone else had a guitar, and the evening was full of music and dust and laughter, and the smell of food that half the town had contributed. Clayton danced. This surprised nearly everyone, because he was not known as a dancing man, but he took Louise's hand at the beginning of the first reel, and she looked at him with her eyebrows raised, and he said, very quietly just for her, "I used to dance before the silence. I'm remembering." She danced with him until her feet hurt and she did not care at all. They drove back to the Double B late in the evening in a wagon that Will had decorated with ribbons against Clayton's expressed preference and Louise's private amusement. The night was cool and clear and enormous around them, and the stars were exceptional, and they rode in a comfortable quiet that was not the old silence, not the hollowed-out kind, but something full and warm and shared. "Married," she said at one point, turning the word over. "Married," he agreed. "I have some opinions about how to rearrange the kitchen," she said. He laughed. She loved his laugh so much more now than she had the first time she heard it, because now she knew everything behind it. "Of course you do," he said. "And about the west pasture fence line, I suspected. And about the Louise," he said, still laughing. "Yes, we have the rest of our lives for you to tell me all of it." She took his arm and leaned into him, and they rode the last mile home in the good darkness of a clear autumn night, the Double B ahead of them with a lamp burning in the window that Will had left lit, and the hills dark and settled around them, and everything felt, in the way that the best things feel when you have worked hard to find them, both right and deserved. Life on the Double B changed in the way that things change when a house that has been quiet for a long time fills up again with purpose, and the particular kind of energy that comes from someone who does not do anything by half measures. Louise took on the books for the ranch, which had been kept competently but not optimally, and within 2 months had identified several areas where the operation was losing money in small ways that added up to a larger problem, and had proposed adjustments that Clayton, to his credit, considered seriously and mostly implemented. She expanded the kitchen garden significantly in the first spring and negotiated a supply arrangement with Mr. Abernathy that gave the ranch better prices on staples in exchange for first access to Double B beef during the market season. She started a lending library in the church, a small shelf of books that she sourced through a contact in Dallas, which Reverend Hollies regarded with ambivalence, but which the people of Dust Creek used with enthusiasm. Clayton watched her move through this expansion of activity, with an expression that combined pride and something close to wonder. He told her one evening, watching her read the ranch accounts with a focused intensity that he had come to regard with deep affection, that he had not realized until she arrived, how much he had been simply maintaining rather than building. "You were building," she said, not looking up from the ledger. "You just needed someone to build with." He was quiet for a moment. "I need you to know," he said, "that I understand the difference between needing someone to help run the ranch and what I actually feel for you." She looked up then. His face was open and direct in the lamplight. "I know the difference," she said. "I have always known." "Good," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he did, with that particular care that she had come to read as the most genuine expression of who he was. Good. They had their first real argument in February. It was about the railroad man, a representative from the Texas Pacific Railway named Good, no relation to the famous one, who had come through Dust Creek in late January proposing to purchase a corridor of land that included the eastern edge of the Double B and two of the creek bed homesteads, including the Prentice Place. The money offered was substantial by Dust Creek standards, and Clayton's initial response had been more open to negotiation than Louise thought was warranted. She said so, clearly, at length, and with a precision that left no aspect of her position unstated. He listened, and then said that while he understood her concerns, he thought she was underestimating the potential benefit to the wider region, and that refusing to negotiate at all was as unwise as agreeing too quickly. She said he was being optimistic about an industry whose track record in dealing with small landowners, particularly homesteaders, was not good. He said she was being reflexively suspicious of something that might, in this case, be straightforwardly beneficial. She said that reflexively suspicious was a condescending characterization of an evidence-based concern. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the particular charged quality of two people who have each said something with a slightly sharper edge than was entirely fair. He said, after a moment, "That was not a fair thing to say." "No," she agreed. "And I should not have implied you were being naive. You're not naive. And you're not reflexively suspicious. You're carefully analytical. The distinction matters," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "it does." They were quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you actually think we should do?" "I think we should talk to the Prentices first," he said, "and to the other landowners, and then decide together." "Yes," she said, "that's what I think too." He reached out and she took his hand, and they sat at the kitchen table in February, with the winter light coming through the window, and the fire going behind them, and the ranch outside doing its quiet winter business. And the argument settled into something that was not a wound, but a reminder of who they were and how they did things, which was, ultimately, together. The railroad matter was eventually resolved through exactly the process Clayton suggested. The landowners organized, presented a collective counterproposal, and negotiated a right-of-way agreement that was considerably more favorable than the original offer. Thomas Prentice, who had initially been frightened into almost accepting the first offer, came out of the process with his water rights fully protected and a payment for the right-of-way that cleared his remaining bank debt. He told Louise, at the signing meeting in Mr. Abernathy's store, that he felt like he had learned something. She told him that was the most valuable thing that could come out of the whole affair. Clara Prentice, who had become something between a friend and a younger sister figure to Louise over the months, told her privately that Thomas had started reading the volume of essays she had seen on Louise's shelf at the Double B, and had come home from that first attempt considerably more talkative and considerably more interesting. Louise laughed. "Good," she said. Spring arrived again, the spring of 1879, which was Louise's second spring in Dust Creek, and she found herself standing on the porch of the Double B on a morning in April, watching the first green appear in the hills, and she thought about the woman who had walked off a stage a year ago with her carpet bag and her chin up, and she felt a warmth for that woman, and for this life that surprised her with its completeness. Clayton came up beside her with 2 cups of coffee and gave her one and stood beside her looking at the hills, and she leaned into him the way she did now, easily and without thinking about it, and he put his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm happy," she said, because she was honest. He pulled her closer. "Good," he said. That spring also brought the news that Louise was expecting. She told Clayton at the kitchen table with the directness she brought to all significant information, and she watched his face move through surprise and then something profound, something she could see going deep into him and changing the landscape of his expression from the inside. He did not say anything for a long moment. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she could see the emotion in him and she wanted to make room for it. "Yes," he said. His voice was not quite steady. He looked at her with those eyes that she knew so well now, that had started as careful and guarded and had become, over months of trust and honesty and shared living, something open and warm and certain. "Louise, yes, I am." He stopped. He was smiling and she could see he was on the edge of something larger than he usually allowed himself. "This is, I know," she said gently. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "You're well, everything is." "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He squeezed her hands. He was still smiling in that new, unguarded way. "A family," he said. "A family," she agreed. Martha, when told, embraced Louise so hard that she had to ask her to ease up. The pregnancy was, in typical Louise fashion, managed with practicality and without excessive ceremony. She continued working for most of it, cut back toward the end, and maintained her opinions on everything throughout, which Clayton had expected, and which he continued to receive with the patient, amused love that had become the particular flavor of their marriage. The baby was born in December of 1879, in the bedroom of the Double B, with Martha and the town's doctor, a kind and competent man named Dr. Hadley, in attendance. It was a long labor, and Louise, who had decided to be honest about the experience rather than stoic, said several things during it that she would not normally have said in mixed company, and which Clayton, who was not allowed in the room by Dr. Hadley but sat on the other side of the door the entire time, heard with an expression that Will later described as a man being wrung out like a washcloth. When Dr. Hadley finally opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Brooks, and both doing very well," Clayton sat still for a moment as though he needed to check that the words were real, and then he stood up with a movement that was somewhere between careful and urgent and went in. The baby was wrapped in the quilt that Martha had made and was lying in Louise's arms, and Louise was tired and flushed and had hair coming out of its braid, and was looking at the baby with an expression that Clayton had never seen on her face before, something that was all the way open, no reserve at all. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, who was small and red and extraordinarily new, and he put one finger against the baby's small fist and felt the fist close around it. And he made a sound then, not quite a word, not quite anything, and Louise leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the December bedroom of the Double B with their son between them and the ranch quiet outside and the winter sky enormous above the Texas hills. "Henry," Louise said. "I would like to call him Henry." "Henry," Clayton said. "Yes. After my brother," she said. "The youngest, he was a good person." "Henry Brooks," Clayton said, and the name settled into the room like something permanent, like a post properly set in good ground. Will and Hector, when they heard, came in from the yard, and both behaved in ways that were contrary to their usual character, Will making a speech that was earnest to the point of being slightly incoherent, and Hector sitting in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and looking at the floor with the soft expression of a man who has survived enough of life to know what is genuinely valuable when he sees it. Martha stayed for the first week, and Louise was grateful for this in a way she found difficult to express without becoming emotional, which was unusual for her, and she told Martha so, which made Martha cry in the comfortable, loving way of sisters who know each other entirely. Denton, who had continued to improve at the Double B, and who had paid off the last of the Pratt debt that winter and had started, with tentative hopefulness, to plan a small extension on his and Martha's house, said at supper one evening, holding Henry with an expression of concentrated care, "I think Dusk Creek turned out all right." Louise looked at Clayton across the table, and he looked back at her with those steady eyes that held everything she had learned to read in them, the warmth and the humor and the deep, settled love that had grown between them over the months, until it was as much a part of the Double B as the walls and the land. "I think so too," she said. The winter passed into spring, and spring into summer, and Henry grew and filled the house with the particular noise and liveliness that an infant imports into a previously quiet space. Clayton, who had been prepared for the disruption but not quite prepared for the love, spent a great deal of his available time in a state of mild, quiet astonishment at the entirety of the situation. He found himself narrating the landscape to Henry, telling the baby about the hills and the sky, and the way the light changed through the day over the eastern ridge. And he realized, with a clarity that was both gentle and immense, that this was what he had been trying to do alone for 4 years, and that it had been waiting for the right audience. Louise watched him do this from across the yard or the porch or the kitchen, and she felt the particular love that comes from seeing someone be fully, unhurriedly themselves, the self they had kept compressed for too long and were now expanding back into with the ease of something natural returning to its proper shape. She said things she thought. She always said things she thought, and Clayton always listened, and they disagreed with the good faith directness of people who trust that the disagreement is not a danger, and they built the Double B and their life on it with the same combined resource that had negotiated the railroad right-of-way, and sorted out the Prentice grazing dispute and cleared Denton's debt, which was the simple, powerful resource of two people who were fully honest with each other and fully on the same side. Henry took his first steps on the porch of the Double B on a September afternoon in 1880, walking from Louise's hands to Clayton's with a focused, lurching concentration that ended in his father catching him and holding him up in the September sky with a sound of pure, unguarded joy that startled the horses in the yard. Louise stood and watched this and felt something so complete and good that she had no words for it, and she found, for one of the very few times in her life, that she did not need them. 2 years after Henry's birth, in the spring of 1882, Louise found herself at the kitchen table with the ledger again, and she said to Clayton when he came in from the yard, "I think we can extend the eastern pasture and run 30 more head." He poured himself coffee and looked over her shoulder at the figures. "Show me," he said, pulling up a chair beside her. She showed him. They talked about it for an hour, back and forth, her with her pencil and the ledger and her precise, efficient mind, him with his knowledge of the land and the cattle and the particular rhythms of the range. And by the end of the hour they had a plan that neither of them had started with, but that was better than either of them would have reached alone. This was the thing, she thought, watching him trace the fence line on the rough map she had drawn. This was what she had been looking for without knowing its precise shape. Not someone who agreed with her, and not someone who simply did not try to quiet her, but someone who met her honestly in the space where things were figured out, and worked there with her, and made what they were building together stronger than either of them could have made it separately. Henry, by this time, was a small, sturdy, opinionated boy who had clearly been paying attention to the kind of household he had been born into. He had his father's eyes and something of his measured quality, but when he spoke with a clarity and a confidence that made Clayton laugh and made Louise feel, privately and without ceremony, deeply proud. That same spring, Louise discovered she was expecting again. She told Clayton at the kitchen table again in the same direct way, and he responded in the same deep, quiet way that was now entirely familiar to her, that inward shift of feeling that she could read in his face like a familiar landscape. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He reached across and took her hands and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Stop asking that every time." "I will not stop asking that every time," he said, with a mild, loving firmness that she recognized as her own approach turned back on her, and she laughed and acknowledged the justice of it. The second baby was born in November of 1882 and was a girl, and Louise named her Margaret after her mother. And Clayton held her in the first hour of her life with the same careful, astonished quality he had held Henry, but with the particular ease of a man doing something the second time that he had found unexpectedly important the first time. Henry, presented with his sister, regarded her with the focused consideration of a nearly 3-year-old who is not sure yet whether this development is to his advantage. Louise watched him watching the baby and said, "She will not replace you. She is entirely her own person." And Henry looked up at his mother with his father's eyes and said, in his clear, deliberate way, "All right, then." Clayton looked at Louise over the baby's head, and she looked back at him, and neither of them could contain it. The laughter that came up between them, quiet and helpless and full of love, in the November bedroom of the Double B Dust Creek continued to be Dust Creek. The railroad came through the following year and changed things in the predictable ways, bringing more people and more commerce, and the particular kind of disruption that attends progress. Silas Pratt sold the Copper Bell to a younger man named Porter who had less ego and better whiskey, and who turned out to be an asset to the town. Reverend Hollies retired and was replaced by a younger minister named Reverend James, who was notably more comfortable with the diversity of opinions that characterized his congregation, and who asked Louise in his first month if she would consider serving on the church charity committee. She accepted and immediately reorganized the committee's record-keeping, which Reverend James received with visible relief. Martha and Denton had a child of their own in 1883, a boy they named Thomas, and Denton had by this point become a man Louise genuinely respected, which was not something she had expected when she arrived in Dust Creek and found him at his kitchen table staring at his shoes. He had made himself, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable help, but genuinely. He had made himself into someone his wife could look at with warmth rather than worry, and someone his son would have as a model worth following. She told him so, directly. At a Sunday supper in the spring of 1884, with Clayton and Martha and the various children around the table, and the evening coming in warm through the windows, she said, "Denton, I want you to know that I am glad you are the man you have become. I did not know when I first came here that you had it in you, but you did, and you did the work to find it." Denton sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Thank you, Louise." Martha was looking at her plate, but there were tears on her face, the good kind, and Clayton met Louise's eyes across the table with an expression that was only for her, the look that carried everything they had built together and everything they were still building, and she felt the full weight of her life in that moment and found it, without any reservation, exactly right. The Double B expanded through the early 1880s into a ranch that was respected throughout the territory. Not the largest operation in the region, but one of the most consistently well-run, and people attributed this to Clayton's steady hand with the land and the cattle, and they were right. But those who knew the household well knew also that the books and the negotiations and the ongoing strategic vision of the operation belonged to Louise, and that the two of them worked in a way that was so integrated that separating out the contributions was like trying to separate a river from its banks. Henry, growing through his early years into a boy of 5 and then 6 and then 7, was being taught to read by his mother with the same directness and patience she brought to everything. And he was, clearly, going to be a person with both an excellent mind and a willingness to use it, which Louise thought was the best combination and worth every moment of the investment. Margaret, meanwhile, was a child of entirely different character, quieter and more given to observation than declaration, and she would sit for long periods watching things with her father's quality of careful attention, and then say one thing that was so precise and unexpected that everyone in the room stopped. "She is exactly like you," Louise told Clayton one evening, watching Margaret watch a sunset with the concentration of a natural philosopher. "She is nothing like me," he said, looking at his daughter. "She is more like you than you think." Louise looked at him. "You observe everything," he said, "and then you say the one thing that is exactly right. She does the same thing, she just takes longer to say it." He glanced at Louise. "So far." She laughed and leaned against him, and watched their daughter watch the sunset, and the evening was warm and full and entirely theirs. There was a hard winter in 1884 and 1885, the kind the territory had not seen in a decade, and it tested the ranch and everyone on it. They lost cattle and a section of fencing, and had 3 weeks in January where the cold was so absolute that the days felt like a kind of siege. But the preparation Louise had insisted on, the extra fodder stores, the reinforced barn, the additional supplies that she had laid in against exactly this kind of contingency, made the difference between a hard winter and a devastating one. And when the spring came, they were still standing, the livestock reduced but not destroyed, the buildings sound, the family intact. On the first warm day of March 1885, Louise went out onto the porch of the Double B and looked at the hills, and the snow was coming off them in thin rivulets, and the sky was the particular sharp blue of early spring, and the air smelled of cold earth and coming green. And Henry came out behind her and stood beside her and looked at the hills with the comfortable silence of a boy who had grown up in a house where silence was not empty. "The creek is running," he said. "It is," she said. "Papa said we can ride out and look at the fence line this afternoon, if you say it's all right." She looked at him. He was 7.5, and he looked at her with his father's eyes, steady and direct, but with something of her own quality in the set of his jaw, that particular certainty. "It's all right," she said. He nodded and went back inside, and she heard him telling Clayton in the kitchen, and she heard Clayton's voice, low and warm in reply, and then Clayton was in the doorway. "Come with us," he said. She looked at him. He was wearing his worn brown hat and the old canvas shirt that she had mended twice and would not let her replace because he said it fit exactly right now. And his face was the face she knew better than any landscape, better than the hills or the sky or the dry creek bed where she had first understood that she was falling in love. "Of course," she said. They rode out together, the 3 of them, with Margaret on the saddle in front of Clayton because she was not yet quite old enough to ride alone, and the spring was coming in over the Texas hills with its particular unstoppable generosity, and the creek was indeed running, a thin bright line in the landscape, catching the sun. Henry rode ahead with the serious purpose of a boy who has been given a mission, and Clayton rode beside Louise, and Margaret pointed at things and named them with the particular satisfaction of a child who has recently acquired enough language to be a reliable narrator of the visible world. And the Double B spread out behind and around them in the good light of a Texas spring morning, and Louise looked at all of it, the land and the sky and the children and the man beside her, and she spoke her mind. As she always did, as she could not help but do. "I love this," she said, "not to any one of them, to all of it." Clayton turned to her and smiled in the full, open way that had replaced the almost smile of the man she had first met, the smile that was entirely his now, that belonged to this life and this morning and this porch and this family. "So do I," he said. They rode the fence line, and Henry found 2 posts that needed resetting and pointed them out with the focused authority of someone who had been paying attention. And Clayton said he was right, and they marked the spots and turned for home in the late morning with the sun high and warm, and the hills coming alive around them with the first green of spring. Louise rode with her face up and the wind taking the end of her braid behind her, and felt, in the full and complete and entirely undeceived way of someone who has lived honestly and thought clearly and spoken truly, that her life was exactly right. Not perfect, because she had never had any use for perfect and did not believe in it as a useful standard. But right, built of truth and labor and love and the particular grace of two people who had found each other in a dust-blasted Texas town and had been brave enough to be honest, and had made, out of that honesty, something that would last. The Double B endured. The family endured. Dust Creek changed and grew and adapted and endured. And Louise Rhodes, who had arrived with her chin up and her carpet bag swinging, who had spoken her mind and not softened it and not put it away, who had found a man who had been surrounded by silence long enough to know the difference between the silence that hollows and the voice that fills, lived her life with the same direct, warm, irreducible truth that she had brought to it from the beginning. And it was good. It was more than good. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. And they both knew it, and in the knowing of it they were, in every way that counted, entirely and permanently and joyfully at home.